This is a production of O'Brien Communications.
Hello, friends. I'm Tim O'Brien. Before we meet our guest today, I want to tell you about something that happened on June 6th of this year. A 17-year-old student at Garfield High School in Seattle was shot and killed in a school parking lot. He was trying to break up a fight between two other boys. There's no way to know if the school shooting could have been prevented, but one thing is clear. There were no police officers at the school that day. This is because the Seattle School Board voted in 2020 to remove the position of school resource officer from the school. Today, we're going to talk about the valuable role those school resource officers play in school communities. Meanwhile, if you're watching on YouTube or Rumble, hit that subscribe button. And if you're listening, wherever you're listening, give us a good rating and review. Today, we're joined by Mo Canady. Mo is the Executive Director of the National Association of School Resource Officers, or NASRO. Mo's been a member of that organization's board of directors since 2005. Before that, he held positions in law enforcement and as an instructor at NASRO. Mo, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Tim. I appreciate you having me.
Well, it's good to have you on. I figured with an issue like this, it's good to talk to someone who's not only speaks for those people, but has been in law enforcement himself. And I wanted to start with that situation in Seattle because it's not just a one-off. It's one of those things that kind of encapsulates the whole issue of why school resource officers are so important. And so let's go back. I'm going to go through the details and then ask you for your take. So Seattle, they decided in 2020 to remove school resource officers from the school. They weren't the only school district to do that. School resource officers had worked at the school. The one that was there was Benny Radford. The students actually called him Officer Benny, so they knew him. He was familiar to them, maybe even friendly. This was in response, this whole removal was in response to ban police officers from schools, and it was kind of tied to that whole defund the police movement that erupted in 2020. So the Seattle School Board declared in a resolution that it would abandon notions of policing and pathology. Those are their words, notions of policing and pathology. And it supported defunding the police. So they cut 100 police officers and $3 million from the police budget for those schools. When you look at this situation now in Garfield High School, would you say that is a symptom of a mistake that they made, or is it even bigger than that?
Well, that certainly was a huge mistake on the part of Seattle. Is it a symptom of that mistake? I don't know. It may be actually a bigger issue. One of the things that we're seeing post-pandemic is gun cases are way up on and around school campuses. Our members are constantly finding weapons that students have brought onto campus. The K through 12 school shooting database at around the fall of 2022 was tracking this to the point that these gun cases were up by around 300%. So yes, removing the protectors, removing SROs, there's no doubt that has to have an impact on this situation.
Again, I'm going to add some details to this because now that shooting happened and there's been media coverage of it, the Seattle Times did a lot of coverage on this, and they now report that the parents at that school are outraged. Some even are saying that they aren't going to send their kids back to the school until there's more concrete information on safety plans for the school. And kids themselves have said that since the ban of the school resource officer, they've seen more guns around the school, absent a police presence in the school. So Seattle, and this is not really affecting the schools yet, but they decided because of crime in the city to start to increase the police budget again. They did this last year in 2023, 3 years after they banned. Do you see them reinstating the SROs in the Seattle schools?
I certainly hope that they do, because we've certainly seen districts who recognize that they had made an error And I get it. After the George Floyd murder, there were about 33 kind of large school districts that almost immediately made the decision to remove police from the schools. That is absolute wrong-headed thinking. That's not where the problem was. And so we were removing police from schools here at a time when we knew we were going to have some challenges as students started to come back to school. So we've seen districts across the country, Denver Public Schools, we've seen Alexandria schools in Virginia, who initially made that decision very quickly after the George Floyd case to remove their SROs, and then wound up bringing them back, recognizing that they needed that presence. And so I certainly hope Seattle follows suit with those school districts.
Well, let's go back to that scenario again, and I'm focusing on Seattle not because it's just that one city, but I think it gives us all the various points to discuss when we talk about the need for SROs. And I think one person might say, a cynic might say, well, they would look at that situation and say, what would one school resource officer have done to prevent that from happening? That still could have happened without a. Now, what's your answer to that?
It's a fair question, and let me provide the answer. One of the things that people have to understand in terms of what an SRO actually is, we're not armed guards. We're not security guards. We're not security monitors. We're talking about professional law enforcement officers who should be carefully selected and specifically trained to work in the school environment. And one of the things that is at the core of our training is around building relationships in that environment. We're talking about community policing at a different level, quite frankly. It is the number one goal of a school resource officer should be to be about building relationships with students, with faculty, and with parents. What comes out of that is something that is now commonly referred to as averted school violence. There's even a database for that, where SROs and other adults in the school environment, through relationships, have received really good intelligence, either from a student or a parent or a faculty member or multiple factions of that, has led them to be able to conduct an investigation that likely stopped an act of school violence.
I think you hit the nail on the head there with what I wanted to talk about, because I had mentioned that in Seattle, that Garfield school, the kids called him Officer Benny, the officer that was there. So he had a relationship with those kids. And I think, not to gloss over what you just said, intelligence gathering. So by building relationships with the students, that officer knows who are the ones he can trust, who are the ones that could be a little bit volatile, high risk, at risk. He learns all these things just by being sort of having his finger on the pulse of the school community, but he's looking at it through a law enforcement prism.
Well, yes, they are looking at it through a law enforcement prism, but as these relationships are built, we know that information that is received through good relationships is much more valuable than information in other regards. In other words, you think about the whole see something, say something mantra, and it's a good idea, but it's a whole different ball game when you can trust who you're sharing the information with. So yes, students come to trust SROs who are doing their job the way they should. Again, carefully selected and specifically trained SROs really do make a difference in that regard.
Yeah, I think one of the things they interviewed, Officer Benny, who's now in Florida, they asked him about some of the things he did on his job. And he had said at one point he arrested a 25-year-old gang leader who was on campus at the school recruiting kids for gang activity. So, and his whole characterization of the job wasn't so much that the police are sort of an intimidating threat to the students, but actually there to protect the students from outside forces.
Yeah, exactly. It's the opposite, quite frankly. They see when SROs do the job the right way, students come to see them as much more than just a law enforcement officer. You mentioned they called him Officer Benny. When I was an SRO, the students called me Sergeant Mo, and I didn't mind that. It wasn't disrespectful at all. It was because we had built a relationship to that level that the communication was there. So yeah, it's about much more than just being some intimidating law enforcement presence. You got to be engaged, and that's where differences get made.
What makes a good school resource officer? I'm sure that not even trained police officers, many are not cut out for that type of work.
Hey, Tim, it's a great question, and here's the thing. The position of school resource officer is the most unique assignment that a law enforcement officer can have. There is nothing else like it, not even close. So that means it takes a unique officer or individual to do the job and do it the right way. So it's not for the majority of law enforcement officers. This is a non-scientific poll, but or really it's just a guess. I've come to the conclusion in being involved in this for over 25 years now that about 10% of law enforcement officers seem to really be cut out for this. It's just that unique. So it has to be a person that is really the most well-rounded officer any department could possibly offer up. When you think about it, we're training them, on the importance of getting in the classroom as a guest speaker, and on the importance of informal counseling in that environment. Not the same job as a counselor, but informal counseling. And then their law enforcement role. So imagine this: an SRO is in a classroom delivering a piece on law-related education, and they hear gunfire. They've got to immediately be able to flip the switch and now become the best tactical officer that department could possibly offer. So you can see it is a really unique position.
Yes, and I think so. That kind of wraps that up as far as what I wanted to cover on that, because now we have other school districts that are doing right now what Seattle has learned the hard way. They're making cuts, and the most notable one that I saw in recent times was the Chicago Board of Education. They unanimously, and this is unanimously voted to terminate their $10.3 million school resource officer programs in the Chicago public schools. And they are one school district of 70 school districts around the country that are still doing this right now. So what they did was they ordered the removal of uniformed police officers before this coming school year starts. And my question is, in light of what's already happening, and I'm not just talking about the schools, you talked about the community too. There's unrest in the community. There's violence in the community. In Chicago, one of the most active cities in the country with gun violence, they see it all around them. Why are they doing this now?
I can't explain it, Tim. I mean, I'm sitting here right now, just 70 miles from Chicago, actually headed to Chicago this afternoon. And we trained, NASRO trained all of those police officers. We've spent a great deal of time training them. We certainly had some really fantastic folks in those trainings. And I know that this is a Chicago Public Schools decision. I don't understand it. I can't even pretend to understand it. They're removing the protectors from schools that really need them, from students that really deserve that level of protection.
I'm in the public relations business, and I deal with crisis and issues work a lot. And a lot of times opponents of something will say, well, there's no evidence of that. There's no data for something like that. And I think that's something that's hard to prove when there is no data, because if an SRO is doing his or her job the right way and they prevent violence from happening, you won't have statistics on something like that, will you?
Yeah, and you make a really good point, because, as you say that, I think a lot about law enforcement presence. And we all, I think, for the majority of us, realize it's common sense to understand that when there's good law enforcement presence, that's a deterrent to crime. It's less likely someone is going to commit a crime when there's law enforcement presence. So yeah, there's no data to necessarily show that. But again, I would quickly refer folks to the Averted School Violence Database, which is housed with Safe and Sound Schools. They can go to their website. They can see the cases in there. I would very quickly refer them to the many instances of active shooter incidents where SROs have stepped in and stopped those situations. Illinois has its own case where in Dixon, Illinois, just a few years ago in 2018, SRO Mark Dallas hears gunfire, goes to the shooter and stops it. There are plenty of cases out there to show that SROs are effective. And again, where there's good law enforcement presence, you're not going to have any crime data.
You have that. And I'm going to add some other things here to get your opinion. These are the people who are critics of the SRO programs in Chicago, mainly. This is from the Chicago media that I'm reading this from. Some have said that the SRO programs lead to higher rates of discrimination, that most arrests involve minority students, and even students with disabilities are targeted. I'm not sure what they mean by that because they didn't elaborate. So what they said, and one person who was interviewed on the Chicago School Board said that police tend to stir things up. Those were his words. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't understand that at all. And I can't imagine that there's any data or truth to show that police stir things up. SROs are trained to de-escalate situations. And we've seen many cases where it's the SRO actually who winds up being the coolest head in the situation and helps to de-escalate it. As far as, the situation regarding juvenile arrest and especially minority youth, I think it's fair to also look at school districts that are predominantly minority youth. And so that's a fair piece of this as well. Here's the thing, that if we look at the overall data on juvenile arrest in this country, it does not support those claims in terms of more juveniles being placed in the juvenile justice system, regardless of their race or ethnicity. Or their issues around disability. That one doesn't make sense to me either. Quite frankly, from 1996 to 2022, juvenile arrests in this country are down by 74%. That just happens to be occurring at the same time that SROs have really come to rise in this country, and our numbers have increased. It's interesting. Around 1996, you see that arrest rate start to go downhill, while the numbers of SROs go up. We train SROs to be responsible around arrests. We don't want to be arresting kids all day and taking them out of school. That's disrupting their education, and it's important that they get that for a lot of reasons. So we really do train SROs to be good filters to arrest. I was an SRO for 12 plus years, and I know I did not arrest any more than 5 students in those 12 years and remove them from school. It wasn't even 5. And that's the story with most SROs. Many make it through the school year and will proudly tell you they didn't have to arrest a student this year.
Well, that's a positive thing. That's also a law enforcement activity. Again, I'm going to come back to these people who were advocating for removal of the SROs in Chicago. The predominant thinking was the solution is heavier reliance on school counselors to deal with the behavioral issues and the mental health issues that are involved. Yeah. Are SROs trained to deal with that?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me just say this. We don't have enough school counselors in this country. I am as big of an advocate for school counselors and for mental health professionals in the school and K through 12 schools that you'll find. They are our partners. This is not for the SRO to come in and save the world on their own. This involves a multidisciplinary school safety team. And so we're part of a team. Counselors are not law enforcement officers. Law enforcement officers are not counselors. Certainly, we're cross-trained in a number of things, but not for us to be the counselor or the mental health specialist. But we do train SROs around adolescent mental health issues. We want them to have a good understanding of that. partly so they can help better de-escalate situations around those issues. And then also, when it comes to mental health, we know it's a significant issue across our country, but certainly among adolescents. And again, we want to be good partners. And so we shouldn't be talking about getting rid of one to gain the other, because we're breaking up the team if we do that.
They're not mutually exclusive. In other words, you're saying they
No,
can
not at all.
collaborate. And it's a holistic problem. As you said, mental health issues are not necessarily criminal issues, but they can lead to criminal activity, like a violent
Certainly.
outburst or something like that, where you have to have someone to deal with that.
Yeah.
There are some other things that I labeled in my notes as failures, and one of them is Nashville, Tennessee, recently declined state funding for SROs, and their reason was more pragmatic. They said they just cannot staff all 70 schools in Nashville that they would need to with SROs. They don't have the resources, the bandwidth. They don't even know if they have the talent pool to draw from. So I'm sure you're familiar with that situation.
Totally. And it's not just Nashville. Across this country, we are in a massive recruiting crisis for law enforcement officers. And that makes, that trickles all the way down to the SRO position as well. We don't have enough people to do the job right now. That's just fact. And that's not just SROs, that's law enforcement, period. And we've got to do a better job of recruiting. And really, we see SROs as probably some of the best recruiters their agencies have. One thing that we have seen some agencies have success with is bringing back recently retired officers who still have their skill set, who can still do the job, and using them in a retired capacity, but in a reserve status, so that they're still, sworn law enforcement officers, but also, again, training them to work in the school environment.
There was one thing, and this, again, it falls under a massive failure. And when I first knew that I'd be talking to you, I wanted to ask you about this. It's not directly related to school resource officers, but it was a school situation, and it was a tragedy, and that's Uvalde in 2022, where you had police on site, tons of police on site, and there was no action. And the critics, the ones in Chicago, I even saw some people who were saying, well, that's why school resource officers don't matter, because they had all those police there and they didn't do it. But that seemed to be a failure of protocol, leadership, systems. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, let me just say that's a horrible statement to make, because there was not an SRO on campus when that happened. So that's unfair. That is quite frankly taking advantage of a horrible situation and trying to make it look like something that it wasn't. It was disgusting to see that level of lack of response. And that department paid dearly for it. And as a matter of fact, we're closely tied to the COPS office with the Department of Justice. They did an extensive report on that, and they'll actually be presenting that at our conference next month. We're not afraid to call out law enforcement when we fail, and we failed in that circumstance. But I would point right back to places like Dixon, Illinois, places like St. Mary's County, Maryland, where SROs responded and did exactly what they were supposed to do, and no doubt saved many lives by doing it.
And those things,
a horrible situation.
And they don't make news.
No, of course
where you succeed.
No.
Yeah. The videos from Uvalde just were shocking when you saw that the lack of action there. So I'd be curious if you can to send us your report, and we'll give an update when you have that publicly. Now SROs are making a comeback. And so after the initial defund the police movement in 2020, by June 2022, at least 8 school districts in the states of Virginia, California, New York, they reversed course. And this is according to Education Week. And Denver recently joined that list in 2023, bringing back SROs.
Yeah.
And the issues they're saying, the issues that are behind this, is that student safety is paramount. It's not like we don't know this,
right?
But it is paramount. And the critics are saying of that it's based on fear, not facts. But it is based on facts, isn't it? The reason they're bringing them back?
It absolutely is. And we've been honored to work closely with Denver Public Schools on this, because bringing SROs back may sound like an easy thing, but it's not, because when they were removed back in 2020, those officers moved on to something else. Some of them have even retired. So now you're having to bring new people back into this situation. So again, you got to make sure you're making the right selection. You've got to make sure that they're specifically trained and that you're doing this the right way. Look, we want good law enforcement in schools, and no one gets more disturbed by an image of bad law enforcement in schools than we do. We want good law enforcement officers, good practices, good training. They got to be advocates for students. That's so important.
Well, I know that, and again, you probably had a hand in this, or at least were consulted on it, but the states of Kentucky and Texas are already passing laws that will require schools to have SROs on site.
Yeah.
So, again, for people that see this more as a safety issue than anything else, that would be good news. Now, I wanted to ask you about something. If you're in the middle of traveling now, I know that when we scheduled this interview that you're in sort of the Mo Canady America Tour 2024. And
it's every summer. It's every summer.
And so I'm going to ask you to put yourself in a very realistic scenario, and that is you go to an airport, any airport in the country, and you see security. There's TSA at the airports.
Yeah.
They are very present. They're in uniform and they're very visible. That makes you safer. Does it make you feel safer seeing that presence?
Yeah, to some degree. I know there are flaws in any system, but yeah, I think that certainly. I'm glad that it's there. Thankfully.
Well, I guess I want to draw a correlation between that and the schools. How important is it that SRO be visible and in uniform?
Critical. I mean, it's critical that they are uniformed in some capacity and that they are as visible as possible. If that's not something, that an SRO is doing, they're doing the job the wrong way. They have to be visible.
I have one final question for you, and it's really, it's a big picture question, and that is, what do you think has to happen next for more school districts to embrace SROs that haven't done it? And some of those that have eliminated the SROs, what needs to be done to convince them that they really need to do that?
This comes down to parents in the community, and the more parents are educated on who we really are and who we aren't, the better off we're going to be. We've partnered with an organization called Stand with Parkland, which is basically run by one of the parents who lost their child at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting, Tony Montalto. And Tony is trying to do his best to get that message out to parents, along with a number of things, but what SROs are and what they aren't, really getting the facts out there.
Mo Canady, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
To learn more about all that we talked about here, please see our episode page at shapingopinion.com. Make sure to leave a rating and review and subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Want to connect? Check out our website, shapingopinion.com. Follow us on the X platform, Facebook or Instagram at Shaping Opinion. And make sure to join our Facebook group called Shaping Opinion Podcast Listeners. Shaping Opinion is a production of O'Brien Communications. Copyright O'Brien Communications 2024.